And joining me in studio, attorney and senior editor at Honest Reporting, Daniel Pomerantz, and from Washington, D.C., senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and former Palestinian negotiator, Gaith Al-Omari. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. We'll start in Washington, D.C. Mr. Al-Omari, UNRWA is saying that it doesn't know why the US is making such a move, that being withdrawing all aid. What do you make of the reasons that have already been given?
I mean, there is conflicting messaging coming from the administration. If you talk to the State Department, they talk about the need to reform UNRWA and to have better burden sharing, meaning the world should pay more of the budget for UNRWA. But you hear something totally different coming from, say, Ambassador Haley in the UN or the White House, who talk about more using cutting aid to UNRWA to pressure the Palestinian Authority to come back to negotiations. With this unclear messaging, the parties, all parties, including UNRWA, are confused as to what to be done in order to forestall American defunding of the organization. All
right, so Dan, to you, what do you make of the argument that UNRWA perpetuates the issue of Palestinian refugees and the issue of the Palestinian right of return?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, Gaith, I'm sorry you're not here in the studio. I've followed your work for years and wish I could meet you here. But it's nice to be able to speak to you. The UNRWA has a lot of problems,
Likewise.
And it's not clear that cutting the funding is the way to solve them. But it's not clear that keeping the funding is a way to solve them either. Now, international law regarding refugees is basically governed by the 1951 Convention on Refugees, which has the main purpose of trying to get refugees settled, to reduce the number of refugees over time. That doesn't mean refugees can always go home if there's war, but refugees and their children eventually become settled, citizens, permanent residents, a new generation moving on with life. And the UN High Commissioner on Refugees has been very successful with that. Palestinians are the only refugee group in the world that have their own agency and their own set of rules that conflicts with the 1951 Convention. And under that set of rules, Palestinians remain refugees indefinitely, even if they become citizens, even if they are multiple generations removed. And that creates a very difficult situation because, say, if a Palestinian is living in a refugee camp in Lebanon, Lebanon is going to have that camp funded by UNRWA and therefore has no incentive to try and incorporate and integrate refugees into a new life, but has an incentive to keep them in that camp at no cost or expense to themselves.
All right, so Gaith, back to you in Washington, D.C. Of course, this issue of the Palestinian right of return and Palestinian refugees continuing to multiply and be supported by this organisation has been a major sticking point in any peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians. What is your take on the organisation's role in this?
You know, of course, there's no doubt that UNRWA is part of perpetuating the refugee definition, but it's a minor part. The idea of being a refugee is so inherent to Palestinian identity. It's perpetuated through a myriad of political, cultural, social narratives that UNRWA only plays a minor part in. So if the U.S. administration thinks that it's going to end the refugee problem by closing UNRWA, they're mistaken. Ultimately, there's only one way to end this refugee issue, which is by negotiations. It is almost taken for granted that in any peace deal there will be no right of return, but unless the sides themselves reach that conclusion, no outside party can actually impose a solution on them. And if you see the U.S. trying to negate this issue before negotiations start, this will only lead the Palestinians to entrench their position even further.
And you're talking about negotiations. Now, we know about this ultimate deal that Trump is yet to reveal. We know the Palestinians want absolutely no part in those negotiations. Do you believe that the US is using this aid organisation as a pawn in this peacemaking deal?
They probably think that they're doing this to apply pressure on the parties. Unfortunately, this is not going to work. For the Palestinian Authority, it will not pressure the PA. It will maybe cause a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, maybe will cause some instability, yet this will not be directed against the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority will actually be shielded from that. The one who will really be damaged by this, in addition to the refugees, is Jordan, where Jordan, a key U.S. ally, a big chunk of the population is of Palestinian origin, and if there's defunding of UNRWA or trying to bypass the refugee issue, then there will be unrest in Jordan, and that's not something that the U.S. or Israel, and of course not Jordan, wants. So there are regional implications, and I don't think that using aid is an effective way of pressuring towards diplomatic achievements.
All right, Dan, what's your take? Could this effectively backfire not only for the United States but for Israel?
Well, I don't think this is about money at all. You know, there's a fund that the Palestinian government has called the Martyrs Fund. It pays people for carrying out acts of terrorism. That fund is at about $403 million per year. America's aid cut to UNRWA is about $300 million. The Palestinian government could make up the difference if they want to, but Palestinian people in need are going to be harmed, not just because of the funding cut to UNRWA, but because the Palestinian government has a priority to perpetuate a refugee situation. And as Gaith said, it's not just a priority for the government, but it has become a part of the Palestinian national identity. And I agree that there's no way to really move forward without making fundamental changes to how Palestinians and Israelis see what their future will be.
So, of course, as you point to, the Palestinian people living in Gaza and living in the West Bank here and around the Middle East, of course, they're the ones that are caught in the middle. So what is Trump cutting all aid to this organisation to achieve? Is this really about reform?
Well, it's not entirely clear what Trump is trying to achieve because he hasn't said what his plan is or how this fits into his plan. We can only speculate. But rather than speculate on what he may be thinking in his mind, I can say that with all the problems that UNRWA has, removing funding from UNRWA doesn't actually solve those problems. Now, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees has been very successful, and I did a little math this morning. If you took the amount of money that UNRWA spends per refugee and applied it to the UNHCR, you could provide for all of the refugees coming out of Syria and still have enough money left over to take care of all Palestinian refugees. It's just a much better, more efficient organization. There should be a way to apply for all people's needs while at the same time removing some of the problems and corruptions that we see in UNRWA.
All right, Gaith, just to close us out, what do you see as the major consequence of this? Of course, you alluded to a few of those, but there are also security analysts who fear, also in Israel, that this could play into the hands of extremists.
You know, I mean, this is true on two levels. In the West Bank, things are fragile. Yes, things are quiet now, but are fragile, and this might be the spark that might start unrest in the West Bank. In Gaza, the administration has been trying now for months to create stability in Gaza by injecting some money into the economy and improving the humanitarian situation. Defunding UNRWA at this juncture in a place that's as vulnerable as Gaza might lead us to actually push us over the edge there, and might lead to a breakdown in Gaza that will end up being translating into an armed conflict between Hamas and Israel. That will, of course, harm Israel, Palestinians, as well as Egypt. So there is a potential for a very destabilizing impact from a move that is, as I see it, that is not very clear what it's hoping to achieve.
All right, and just finally to you, Dan, I suppose, how do you see this all playing out in the end? Because, of course, we're going to have Trump revealing this ultimate peace deal, which the Palestinians want no part of, and then you have a completely collapsed UN organisation here for these Palestinians.
Well, the organisation isn't collapsed. It's already getting funding filled in from Europe and from other sources. And I should point out that even as Israel is publicly praising the funding cut, Israel has also been quietly urging the administration since January to not make the funding cut. And if all funding really does get cut off, according to the Israeli Supreme Court, Israel will end up having to foot the bill. One way or another, we're going to have to move forward in peace and in a new future, but funding cuts in UN organizations, as corrupt and as problematic as they are not going to be the solution.
All right, well, it seems that there's some agreement on that. Gaith Al-Omari in Washington, D.C., appreciate that insight, and, of course, Dan Pomerantz, thank you for being with us here